Hello, everyone. I hope you're all continuing to do well during the coronavirus lockdown, and I hope you're all staying safe. One of the biggest challenges with this coronavirus situation is not knowing how long it's going to last. The entire thing isn't going to go away tomorrow, and we don't really have a specific timeline when we know it's going to end. That often creates some difficulties in getting through a situation. We often are able to get through a situation when we have a plan, when we know how long it's going to last, but at present, we're just not sure. And so I think that offers us an opportunity as Christians to reflect on what it means to endure. So I want to share some thoughts from the Bible about enduring well, and I want to start by turning to the book of Hebrews. The author of Hebrews is writing to a group of Christians who are going through a struggle at the time of this letter. And we don't know everything about their trials, but beginning in verse 32, we see some things about how difficult it was. He writes, "But remember the former days when, after being enlightened, you endured a great conflict of sufferings, partly by being made a public spectacle through reproaches and tribulations, and partly by becoming sharers with those who were so treated. For you showed sympathy to the prisoners and accepted joyfully the seizure of your property, knowing that you have for yourselves a better possession and a lasting one." These Christians had been publicly humiliated and had their property taken, and yet the author reminds them that when that happened, they had maintained joy. But it appears that another trial had come. And this second trial was beginning to take its toll on the Christians to the point that they were seriously beginning to consider quitting their faith. In one sense, the Hebrew Christians seem to have been going through a challenge that everyone has gone through, that we all face from time to time. And that is starting strong, but losing our resolve. How many times have we all made a resolution, a determination to change our habits, and we start with zeal? Then we encounter some difficulties at first, and we often are able to overcome those. And this seems to be what happened with the Hebrew Christians. Again, back in verse 32, the author writes, "Remember the former days when, after being enlightened, you endured a great conflict of sufferings." After they first came to Christ, they gladly accepted the seizure of their property. They had that zeal, that enthusiasm, and it got them through those difficulties. We can often get through that first wave, but if we're going to do anything worthwhile for any length of time, then we're going to have difficulties that come in waves. Most Americans will be able to handle the challenge that we're going through right now with the coronavirus because it's new, we have a collective plan of attack, but how long will our resolve last? How long until this is no longer a new experience and something that we can band together and get through? I think we're already seeing the resolve of politicians and Americans beginning to waver. How long can we hold out? How long can we deal with this coronavirus? It's going to take endurance to get through this situation. Back in Hebrews chapter 10, if we continue in verse 35, the author, having reminded them that they got through that first wave, now encourages them to get through the second wave. He says in verse 35, "Therefore, do not throw away your confidence, which has a great reward, for you have need of endurance, so that when you have done the will of God, you may receive what was promised." The Hebrew Christians need endurance if they're going to get through that second wave. When the difficulties feel like they're not going to end, when they feel as if the pain of the trial is not worth it, that's the time when people usually quit. And that's the time that the Hebrew author encourages them to have endurance. The fact is that God is only going to have a people who are willing to endure. When we control ourselves enough to where we can endure through the difficulties of temptations and trials, that's when we start to transform as Christians and when we start to show our loyalty to God. While we endure, it seems passive to us because we often feel like we're not doing anything. But the fact is, God is being active, and our endurance leads to a deeper bond with God and a greater faith in the hope that He has put before us. And that's what the Hebrew author finally reminds them of in chapter 10 and verse 37. He says, "For yet in a very little while he who is coming will come and will not delay. But my righteous one shall live by faith. And if he shrinks back, my soul has no pleasure in him. But we are not of those who shrink back to destruction, but those who have faith to the preserving of the soul." The situation we're in now gives us an opportunity to remember that endurance leads to the hope that we have in Christ. Endurance in this world and in this life doesn't necessarily lead to something better. Every path, every road leads to death. But with God, our endurance leads to the preserving of our souls. It's not enough, however, to simply get through a situation, to last long enough to see the situation behind you. What we want to do as Christians, and what God calls us to do as Christians, is endure well. And I think this is where we can be an example as Christians to those around us. We can be an example not only of endurance, but of how to endure well. Those are the two options that we face as we come through any difficulty. Things may pass, time may pass. We may get through something that's happening to us, but did we endure well? And so I'd like for us to look quickly at two examples in the Bible. The first example is an example of how not to endure. And that is the example we have of the Israelites as they're first being led through the wilderness by Moses. Exodus chapter 16, beginning in verse 2 says, "The whole congregation of the sons of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. The sons of Israel said to them, 'Would that we had died by the Lord's hand in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the pots of meat, when we ate bread to the full. For you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger.'" Of course, God is going to provide for the Israelites. He didn't take them out into the wilderness to die. He took them out into the wilderness so that they could get to the promised land. And He has every intention of preserving all of them, but He needs them to endure. But the Israelites whine and complain and give us a negative example of endurance here. If Christians during these times are following the protocols that we're supposed to follow, and yet we're whining and complaining and talking about how frustrated we are, then we're not being a good example of enduring well. If we're questioning everyone and everything and showing a lack of peace, a lack of gratitude, then we're acting like the Israelites in the wilderness. It matters not only that we get through this situation, but as Christians, it matters that we get through it with the right attitude. As a positive example of how to endure well, we can look at Isaiah chapter 53, specifically verse 7, where it says, "He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to slaughter, and like a sheep that is silent before its shearers, so he did not open his mouth." Jesus, as He went to the cross, gives us the ultimate model and example of how to endure suffering well. Jesus did not go to the cross kicking, screaming, whining, complaining. And of course, if he did do all of those things, we would think, well, he'd be justified. But he went nobly. Jesus went to the cross with dignity. He showed us not only endurance, but how to endure well. So that's the challenge I would like to give to us in this video, is that we not only endure, but that we endure well so that other people can see the endurance of Christ in us. That way, God will be glorified in our actions. I hope this message is beneficial to you all, and I hope you continue to stay safe during this time, and I pray that we'll all be able to endure well. God bless you.